When I asked about my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law smirked and said it already happened. Only special ones were there. A week later, she called me crying. The rent is overdue. Did you pay? I smiled and replied, didn't I warn you? Those words spoken and answered became the bookends of my awakening. My name is Mrs. Cole. I am 71 years old, a retired high school teacher who spent decades guiding other people's children while pouring every ounce of love into my only son, Daniel. I never imagined that one day I would be treated as though I was no more than a stranger at his table. Clara's smirk that day wasn't careless, it was deliberate. She wanted me to feel cut out, invisible, irrelevant. Daniel stood behind her, shifting uncomfortably but saying nothing. His silence was worse than her cruelty. At that moment, the grandfather clock in my living room struck 12. The sound echoed through the hardwood floors, each chime heavy, as though time itself was delivering the verdict I did not belong. Later on Facebook, the truth glared at me. Photos of the wedding tagged the previous afternoon location, stamped clearly the chapel downtown where I once donated money for repairs. Daniel looked sharp in a navy suit, Clara in a glowing white gown. My throat closed when I recognized the dress had been rented with a credit card bill I had paid off for them just weeks earlier. I stared at the pictures, and the memory of those 12 chimes filled the silence. This is where I pause and ask you listening now. Do children have the right to marry while excluding their parents? Some might argue marriage is for the couple, not the family. But what about gratitude? What about acknowledgement? Second, who decides who the special ones are? If a mother who spent decades covering rent, paying for groceries, keeping the lights on is not special, then the word itself has lost its meaning. And third, does this reflect a larger issue in our generation? Divide elders are often spoken of as burdens only valued when their bank accounts are open. Is this the new definition of family? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Instead, I turned the phone face down on the oak dining table that had stood in my home for decades. My hands traced the grooves in the wood, the scratches from when Daniel used to run his toy cars across it. The marks left from Sunday, roasts the quiet evenings when my late husband Richard read the paper there. That table had been the altar of our family. Now it sat like a witness to my erasure. The bitterness of the moment threatened to swallow me, but anger didn't win that day. I thought of the receipt still folded in my drawer, the gown Clara wore rented on a card I had rescued them from, the countless bills for late rent payments, the grocery list scrawled in Daniel's handwriting, handed to me with quiet expectation. I was the safety net, and in return, I was cast aside. Still, I refused to give Clara the satisfaction of watching me shatter. I went into the kitchen and brewed a small pot of coffee. The smell was sharp, slightly burned, but familiar. I poured it into the chipped ceramic mug Richard had used every morning. Holding it steady between my palms, I whispered to myself, silence is sometimes louder than words. When Clara stepped out to answer her phone, Daniel finally looked at me. His eyes flickered with something. Was it guilt? Shame for a heartbeat. I believed he might speak, that he might say, Mom, you should have been there. But no words came. He looked down, swallowed, and stayed silent. That was the moment I understood. Hesitation is not the same as courage. He had made his choice. I adjusted the shawl on my shoulders, and walked toward the door. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. My footsteps echoed against the wooden floor, and behind me, the grandfather clock ticked relentlessly, each beat like a drum, announcing the end of one chapter of my life. The night air outside was crisp and cold. Streetlights buzzed overhead, stretching my shadow long across the sidewalk. I wrapped my coat tighter, but inside I felt something unexpected clarity. For decades I had poured money and love into a well that never filled. I had believed my sacrifices guaranteed me a place at Daniel's side, but the truth was laid bare. I wasn't special to them unless my wallet was open. That night, as the clock struck 12, I made a decision. I would no longer be an ATM with feelings. I would no longer buy my place at their table. And with that realization, something inside me healed, not the wound of betrayal, but the part of me that had been chained to their approval. Silence is sometimes louder than any words. So I ask you, the one listening to me now, there are nights when I sit at the oak dining table with nothing but a stack of papers and the quiet tick of the grandfather clock. That table has seen love, laughter, and family, but it has also seen the truth written in numbers, the kind of truth that can't be erased by a smile or rewritten in a Facebook post. I remember one evening in particular. My arthritic fingers trembled as I counted through a small pile of cash. $20 bills, one after another. The paper felt dry, stiff, almost brittle against my skin, while my hands, once steady enough to grade hundreds of essays, shook uncontrollably. Arthritis had crept into my bones, but I still forced myself to count carefully. 1, 2, 3. All the way until I had enough to cover yet another bill Daniel had slipped into my purse, as though it were a note asking for a sandwich. The ledger of my sacrifices is long. I still keep the receipt for the roof repairs, $2,300, dated September 14th, with the contractor's name signed at the bottom in blue ink. That was the year a storm tore through the neighborhood, and Daniel insisted he couldn't afford the damage. I told him I'd help just this once. Of course it wasn't just once. Then there were the monthly checks, $500 every month each one, with a clear serial number printed neatly in the corner. I wrote them faithfully even when my pension barely stretched far enough. Those checks weren't just pieces of paper. They were pieces of me, my groceries, my heating bill, my little luxuries sliced away and handed over. And now I ask you, do parents have a responsibility to pay their adult children's debts? Some might argue, yes, that family means helping no matter what. But if your child is 35 years old, working, married, shouldn't there be a line? How much sacrifice is enough? Is it measured in dollars, in hours of lost sleep, in years of working long after your body begs for rest? And the hardest question of all, can love be measured in money? If everything I've given is dismissed as not special, then maybe I've been confusing the two all along. There were times I convinced myself I was just being a mother. That's what mothers do. They show up, they patch the holes, they hold everyone together. But over time, I began to feel like I wasn't holding a family, I was holding a bottomless pit. One night, I brewed myself a small pot of coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, bitter and strong, and I poured it into Richard's old chipped mug. I sat at the table, wrapped my hands around the warmth, and let the steam fog my glasses. It was the only moment in days I had done something purely for myself. A tiny act of healing, but healing nonetheless. I told myself, you have loved enough. You have sacrificed enough. If they cannot see it, that does not mean it isn't real. I want to share this with you, the listener. Have you ever mistaken love for numbers? Have you ever told yourself, if I just give a little more, they'll finally understand how much I care? That's the trap I lived in for years. I thought every check, every receipt, every $20 bill was proof of love. But in truth, love never needed that kind of proof. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background, indifferent to my exhaustion. Time moved forward while I sat there drowning in paperwork that should never have been mine. Each receipt, each check, each stack of bills, it was all a history of my giving a history Daniel and Clara would never honor. But that night, I also felt something shift. As I set down my pen and closed the ledger book where I had recorded every payment, I realized I had been keeping score, not to shame them, but to remind myself I wasn't imagining it. My sacrifices were real. They had names, dates, amounts. They were carved into my life. The debate may rage forever about what parents owe their children. But here is what I know. Love is not a credit line. It is not a recurring transfer. It is not measured in balances or debts. That night, as I drained the last sip of bitter coffee, I felt a calmness settle in my chest. Not joy, not peace exactly, just clarity. For the first time, I told myself, you have done enough, more than enough. and the clock struck midnight again, 12 slow notes ringing through the house. But this time, the sound didn't feel like judgment. It felt like release. The sound of the grandfather clock woke me before the sun did. 6 slow chimes, steady and deep, rolled through the house like waves on a shore. Each one echoed in my chest. I opened my eyes in the gray light of dawn, the kind of light that makes everything look softer, yet somehow more unforgiving. I shuffled toward the bathroom, leaning on the doorway as I turned on the sink. The metal faucet coughed and dripped one rusty drop after another. The sound mingled with the fading chimes of the clock, a duet of time and neglect. I caught my reflection in the mirror. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. The lines carved across my face looked deeper than I remembered. The eyes staring back at me seemed hollowed by sleepless nights. And yet there was something there, something steadier. A decision was forming, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a shout, but with a whisper that refuses to be silenced. I carried my mug of coffee back to the dining room and sat at the oak table, my laptop open in front of me. The screen glowed, showing my bank account. Right there in bold blue letters was the button Cancel Recurring Transfer. For years, those transfers had been the lifeline for Daniel and Clara and the chain around my neck. $500 every month, no questions asked. A ritual I performed like prayer, except this altar demanded sacrifice without faith or gratitude. I stared at the button. My finger hovered over the trackpad, trembling not from arthritis this time, but from the weight of choice. This is where the debates become sharp personal. Do parents owe their children simply for bringing them into the world? Daniel once shouted at me, "I didn't ask to be born." The words pierced me then, and they still sting now. But I wonder, does existence itself create an eternal debt, or is the gift of life enough? Do older people have the right to keep their finances for themselves? Too often, I've heard whispers in grocery store aisles. She's old. What else does she need the money for? As though years of work, of sweat, of saving were meant to be stripped away the moment you reach retirement. And the question I dread the most, should family depend on money to survive? If love collapses when the checks stop coming, was it love at all? I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with air that felt heavier than it should. My hand stopped trembling. I pressed the button. Click. The screen refreshed. A message appeared. Recurring transfer canceled. Just like that. Years of giving stopped by one small motion of my finger. The house went still. No applause, no voices, no recognition. Just the quiet triumph of reclaiming something that had been mine all along. I looked back into the mirror across the hallway. The woman staring at me was the same one who had been erased from wedding photos, the same one who had carried the weight of her son's debts. But this time, I didn't see absence. I saw resolve. My eyes no longer hollowed but sharp alive, and for the first time in years, mine. That reflection healed something deep in me. It told me, you are still here. You are still yourself, and you don't need to buy anyone's love. I want to pause here and ask you, the one listening, if you were in my place, would you have the courage to stop? Would you risk losing the illusion of family to protect your dignity? Would you endure the silence, the backlash, the anger, just to free yourself? These are not simple questions, but the moment my finger pressed that button, I realized something: the cost of continuing was far higher than the cost of ending. The grandfather clock ticked on, not judging this time, not accusing, just keeping time as if marking the beginning of a new chapter. And I, sitting at my oak table with the glow of the laptop fading into standby, felt the first flicker of freedom. The knock at the door came just after lunch, sharp and insistent. My heart sank before I even stood up. Something in the rhythm of that knock told me this was not a neighbor, not a friend. When I opened the door, the hinges groaned under the weight of the moment. The wooden door creaked as if it too resisted what was about to enter. And there they stood, my son Daniel, his wife Clara, and a tall man in a dark suit I had never met. The man introduced himself smoothly, Mr. Fisher, attorney at law. He adjusted his tie as though he were walking into a boardroom instead of an old widow's living room. Clara strutted in behind him, her heels clicking on my hardwood floor, and tossed her Coach handbag onto the oak table with a thud that made me flinch. I knew before they even spoke why they were here. My son avoided my eyes, but his fists clenched as if he was bracing for battle. Fisher pulled out a folder from his briefcase and spread the papers neatly across my oak table, like cards in a game he was sure to win. At the top of the page, in neat Times New Roman font, were the words, "Power of Attorney." That single phrase hung in the air heavier than any accusation. They wanted control, not help, not love, not reconciliation, control. The debates rose in my mind immediately sharp and cutting. Do children have the right to force their parents to sign away power of attorney, to take the pen from a hand that once fed them, once taught them to write their own names, and demand it scribble away independence? Can a lawyer stand ethically on the side of greed to represent not justice, but entitlement, knowing well the harm it inflicts? I studied Fisher's face as he slid the documents closer. His eyes betrayed nothing, only the cold efficiency of a man billing by the hour. And the harshest thought of all, is it true what Daniel had screamed at me weeks before, that I owed him my youth, because he had given me his? Could years of caregiving, of late-night phone calls, of financial rescues, be balanced against diapers, scraped knees, and school tuition I had once covered for him? Daniel finally spoke, his voice cracking with anger and something that might have been pain. "You owe me, Mom. You owe me for every year I stayed instead of leaving, for every sacrifice I made for this family. You owe me for my youth." The words hit me like a stone. My breath caught, but I forced myself not to recoil. I remembered the nights he stayed out late, the credit card bills I paid, the jobs he quit because they were beneath him. Sacrifice. Perhaps in his mind. But in mine, it had always been me carrying the weight. I drew a steady breath. Healing does not always come as a soft whisper. Sometimes it arrives in the form of calm defiance. I rested my hand on the oak table, steadying myself, and looked directly at Daniel. My voice was quiet but firm. Debt ends where dignity begins. The room fell silent. Even Fisher paused his pen, hovering above the signature line. Clara scoffed, but her eyes flickered nervously toward the clock in the hallway. Its pendulum swung slowly, each tick-tock echoing like a witness to this confrontation. I refused to sign. Fisher cleared his throat, his professional mask slipping slightly. "Mrs. Cole, I assure you this is only to protect your best interests." I raised my hand, cutting him off. "No. My interests are not written in your contracts. They are written in the life I still live." Clara muttered something under her breath, grabbing her handbag from the table with a sharp jerk. Daniel's face reddened, his lips quivering with the urge to shout. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. I walked to the door, opened it wide, and stood waiting. "Out," I said simply. They hesitated. Daniel looked at me one last time, his eyes glassy, his voice trembling with rage. "You'll regret this." But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I held the door open until the three of them stepped outside. Fisher adjusting his papers, Clara huffing, Daniel staring at the ground. I closed the door behind them. The latch clicked shut with a finality that filled me with more relief than fear. I leaned against the wood, the echo of their footsteps fading. My chest rose and fell steady. Not victorious, not yet, but intact. And that for the moment was enough. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, dignity begins when fear ends. The clock ticked on, and I walked back to the oak table, untouched papers still lying there. I gathered them up, slid them into an envelope, and tucked it away in the drawer. Evidence, not surrender. For the first time in a long while, I felt something return, something that had been drained by years of silent giving. A quiet strength. Not the strength of youth or money, but of resolve. I knew the battle was only beginning, but for now I had defended the only thing they couldn't take with ink on paper, my will. The next morning I dressed more carefully than usual. A navy cardigan over my blouse, sensible shoes polished until they almost shone. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. I was going to the bank and I needed to look like someone who could not be pushed around. The walk there was short, just 4 blocks, but every step felt like a mile. The summer heat clung to me, and the weight of yesterday's confrontation still pressed on my shoulders. Yet the tick-tock of the grandfather clock echoed in my memory, urging me forward. When I arrived, the air conditioning blasted cold against my face, a welcome shock. I approached the counter where Mr. Klein, the banker, sat. He had helped me with routine transactions for years. Today his glasses caught the light as he looked up. "Good morning, Mrs. Cole," he said kindly. "How can I help you?" I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "I want to cancel all automatic transfers from my account to Daniel's." His eyebrows rose, but he didn't question me. Instead, he nodded, clicked through his computer, and began typing. Here's where the debates live, tangled like knots I had to untie. Is it wrong for parents to cut off financial support? Society whispers that a good mother never stops giving, that her purse strings should be as eternal as her love. But I wondered, when does generosity stop being love and start becoming servitude? Do banks have a duty to protect the elderly? Too many stories circulate of seniors losing everything to fraud or manipulation. Should it be the banker's job to intervene when something feels wrong, or does their responsibility end at the transaction? And the question that haunts me still, does cutting off money mean cutting off family? Was I severing not just a financial lifeline, but the last fragile thread binding Daniel to me? Mr. Klein typed steadily. I watched as his fingers moved across the keyboard, every keystroke sounding louder than it should. Finally, he turned the screen toward me. There it was, in black letters on a pale background, canceled. The word felt both terrifying and liberating, like slamming a door and opening a window at the same time. He printed out the confirmation sheet. The paper slid from the printer, stamped with today's date. I held it in my hands, the ink still warm. A single page that represented years of sacrifice now ended with finality. "Are you sure about this?" Mr. Klein asked softly. His voice carried no judgment, only concern. "Yes," I said, steadier than I felt. "I've given enough." Walking home, I felt lighter, though my legs trembled. For the first time in years, I knew my next paycheck would stay in my account. That money could pay for my medicine, or maybe a new water heater, or even just fresh flowers for the kitchen. When I reached home, I logged into my online banking. For the first time, the numbers didn't look depleted. There was a positive balance staring back at me. Not a fortune, but enough to remind me that I still owned something of my own. I let out a long breath, one I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. It came out shaky, but it carried with it the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Just as I was setting the confirmation slip onto the oak table, my old phone vibrated, the Nokia brick buzzing violently against the wood. Daniel's number flashed on the tiny green screen. My heart jumped, but I didn't pick up. It rang again, then again, insistent. I imagined his voice on the other end, angry, pleading, accusing. Perhaps all three, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Not today. I stared instead at the grandfather clock across the room. Tick, tock. Each beat steadier than my pulse. For the first time, those sounds didn't feel oppressive. They felt like markers of freedom. Each tick said you are no longer trapped. Each tock said you are still standing. I knew people might say I was cruel, that mothers should never shut the door on their children, no matter the cost. But what those people didn't see were the empty cupboards, the unpaid bills, the nights lying awake in worry. They didn't hear the condescension in Clara's voice or the demand in Daniel's eyes. To them, love is endless giving. To me, love is not meant to destroy the giver. So I sat at the oak table confirmation slip beside me and allowed myself a small healing moment. I thought of the meals once shared here, the laughter, the long talks with Richard. For a long time, I had believed those memories justified my continued sacrifice. But now I realize those memories were mine to treasure, not debts to be repaid. I closed my eyes and whispered, "This is not the end of love. This is the end of being used." The clock ticked again, steady, faithful. And I realized that each second passing was no longer another piece of me being drained away. It was time being returned to me. For the first time in years, I felt the rhythm of freedom in those chimes. The silence after cutting Daniel off felt heavier than I expected. For days, the phone hardly rang. No footsteps at my door, just the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. It should have felt peaceful, but instead it echoed with loneliness. One late afternoon, as the light slanted gold across the oak table, I heard a knock. This time it was softer, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, Eleanor stood there balancing a tray wrapped in a checkered cloth. "I baked cornbread," she said with a smile that reached her tired eyes. She placed the warm pan of cornbread onto the oak table. The buttery smell filled the kitchen, carrying with it something I hadn't realized I missed: comfort that wasn't purchased or demanded, but offered freely. Later that evening, I found an envelope tucked under my door. Inside were handwritten cards from the garden club. The script was shaky, each letter betraying the tremors of age, but the words were steady. "We stand with you." The notes were written in unsteady hands, but with unwavering care. Above us, the old ceiling fan rattled and whirred, the sound imperfect but familiar. We sat beneath it, Eleanor and I, as if the fan were a canopy sheltering us from judgment. The questions bubbled up inside me, questions that society never answers cleanly. Can friends ever replace family? Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, yet the people who carried my name had abandoned me, while those who shared only a street address were holding me up. Should neighbors step into private family matters? There are those who say, "Don't get involved. It's none of your business." But what happens when silence becomes complicity? When closing your eyes means allowing injustice to bloom? What role does community have in protecting the elderly from abuse? Is it enough to call authorities when something looks suspicious, or is true community the act of sitting at someone's table, holding their hand, reminding them they are not forgotten? Eleanor reached across the table, her palm soft but firm against mine. "You're not alone," she said. Her eyes glistened, and in that moment I realized she wasn't speaking only to comfort me. She was speaking her own truth. She told me about her daughter, how years ago she had drained Eleanor's savings in the name of helping with bills, how it had taken Eleanor nearly a decade to climb back from the brink. "I know what it feels like," she said. "They make you think you're selfish when all you're doing is surviving." Her story mirrored mine, but instead of making me feel trapped, it gave me perspective. Pain shared is pain lightened. I let myself breathe. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt the loneliness loosen its grip. I wasn't the only one carrying scars. I wasn't some anomaly, some cold mother who had turned her back on her children. I was part of something bigger, a quiet legion of parents, mostly unseen, who had given everything and finally said enough. The oak table had once been the altar of sacrifice stacked with checks and receipts. Tonight it was a gathering place where cornbread crumbs scattered on a plate meant more than all the money I had ever handed over. I thought of the cards from the garden club, old friends, some I hadn't seen in months, all sending their strength through shaky words. Their loyalty told me what Daniel and Clara never could, that I was worth standing beside. Eleanor squeezed my hand once more, and I felt something inside me soften. Healing doesn't always come from those you expect. Sometimes it comes from the neighbor who knocks with cornbread. Sometimes it comes from a card written with trembling fingers. I realized then family isn't always given. Sometimes family is chosen. I looked straight into the camera in my mind, speaking not just to myself, but to anyone who might one day face the same silence. Sometimes the real family is the one you choose. That night, as the ceiling fan whirred above and the grandfather clock ticked steady in the hall, I felt less like a solitary widow and more like part of a circle. Not the circle I had expected, but one that held me nonetheless. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it no longer ruled me. Instead, it became a reminder where blood abandons community can step in. And for the first time in a long time, I went to bed not fearing the silence, but welcoming it. It was a Tuesday when the knock came again, not the soft knock of a neighbor nor the heavy pounding of Daniel's anger. This one was official, calculated 3 sharp raps that made the air tighten around me. When I opened the door, a woman in a navy jacket stood there. She held a clipboard against her chest pen clipped neatly on top. My eyes flicked down to the page. In bold letters, I caught the timestamp, 2:45 p.m. June 14th. "Mrs. Cole," she asked. I nodded. "I'm with County Social Services. We received a call expressing concern about your well-being. I'd like to come in and ask you a few questions." Behind her, I could see her shoes' sensible flats, but the smell of disinfectant clung to the rubber soles, sharp and clinical. The kind of smell that reminded me of hospitals, of being examined, prodded, doubted. I let her in, though every muscle in me screamed that this was not care, but intrusion. The Ring camera by my door clicked on, recording everything. At least I had a witness. She sat at my oak table unfolding forms. "These are just standard assessments," she explained, but her tone carried a weight. It wasn't neutral. It was the voice of someone looking for cracks. The questions of fairness roared in my mind. Is it just for children to call in social workers as a weapon against their parents, to use the language of protection not to safeguard but to strip away independence? Can welfare systems be abused? They are built to shield the vulnerable. Yet what happens when those systems become tools in the hands of manipulators, pointed like spears at the very people they were designed to defend? Are the elderly too easily branded as incompetent? One misplaced word, one shaky hand, and suddenly you are no longer trusted to handle your own life. She asked me my name, my age, the date. I answered clearly, letting my voice cut through the air with more force than I expected. Then came the sharper question, "Who manages your finances, Mrs. Cole?" I lifted my chin. "I do." Her pen hesitated over the paper. "Are you certain we've been told you've been forgetful?" I leaned forward. If I were forgetful, who paid 3 years of rent for Daniel, who covered the $2,300 roof repair, who kept every single receipt in order in a folder by year? My voice was steady, even rising, though my heart pounded. For a moment, she didn't write anything. She just looked at me, eyes narrowing as if measuring truth against accusation. The silence was broken by the deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It struck 3 each tone, echoing through the house. It felt less like a clock and more like a gavel affirming my words, grounding me. She shifted in her seat, her confidence cracking ever so slightly. "Well," she murmured, "you certainly seem lucid." Lucid. As if clarity were the exception, not the rule. But in that moment, I realized clarity was my weapon. Not shouting, not pleading, but the unshakable calm of truth. I watched her scribble notes, but slower now. Her earlier certainty had faltered. I could see it, the doubt creeping in about the people who had made the call. Clara's shrill voice, Daniel's trembling anger, they had painted me as unstable. Yet here I was, calm, exact, unbroken. And for the first time, the power tilted. She closed her folder, slid her pen back onto the clip. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Cole. I'll be reviewing this, but I don't see any immediate concerns." Relief washed over me, not as a flood, but as a slow, steady tide. I hadn't just defended myself, I had planted doubt in the story Daniel and Clara tried to spin. As she stood to leave, I walked her to the door. The Ring camera clicked again, recording her polite handshake, her careful goodbye. When the door closed, I exhaled deeply. The air felt clearer, lighter. I looked again at the clock. Its pendulum swung with mechanical certainty. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Only this time it didn't sound like a countdown to my defeat. It sounded like vindication. I whispered to myself, voice low but steady. Sometimes the truth needs no defense but time itself, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel under siege. I felt seen. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it slips in, quietly hidden in signatures and whispers until it finally cracks the floor beneath you. I discovered the first fracture on a Tuesday afternoon. A stack of papers had been slipped into my mailbox medical forms I was supposed to have signed. But as I studied them under the kitchen light, one detail caught my eye. At the bottom, where my name should have been, there was a messy scrawl in blue ink. The pharmacist had signed incorrectly with a blue pen that didn't match the usual black I used. At first I thought it was a mistake, but mistakes I've learned don't come alone. The second fracture came through technology. I pulled up the Ring camera files dated June 17th. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Clara standing at my doorway, her hand sliding into my mailbox, her eyes darting up and down the street. She pulled out papers, flipped through them, and tucked them into her purse. And then the third fracture confirmation, too painful to ignore. My neighbor Davis, whom I had once trusted to water my plants when I was away, appeared in a short clip, glancing around nervously, before tucking a white envelope of $200 into his pocket. Payment for a lie. The questions burned hotter than any wound. Can money buy lies? Of course it can. That's the oldest trade in the world. But to see it in your own neighborhood, your own pharmacy against your own blood, is a kind of wound that no ointment heals. When a witness lies, does that make them complicit in abuse? To me, yes. To put your signature or your silence on someone else's cruelty is to share in the crime. And the sharpest question of all, can families sink so low as to betray one another for scraps of control? The answer sat in front of me, undeniable. Signed in blue ink, captured on video, sealed with $200. I laid everything out on the oak table. The table that once held birthday cakes and Sunday roasts now bore evidence like a battlefield. The forged signature. The Ring footage paused at Clara's guilty hand. The still frame of Davis pocketing the money. Piece by piece, I spread them out like cards in a hand too strong to fold. The pendulum of the grandfather clock swung behind me, its steady rhythm underscoring each revelation. My hands did not shake this time. Instead, my eyes sharpened. Each document, each receipt, each file was no longer just proof of betrayal. It was proof of my endurance. I leaned back, staring at the table, and something inside me shifted. Healing isn't always gentle. Sometimes it comes in the steel of realization. For years, they had spoken louder, drowned me out with accusations, with demands. But here, in black ink, blue pen, time-stamped video and marked bills, I had something stronger. I whispered aloud, letting the words hang in the air. Paperwork speaks when mouths lie. The phrase steadied me, rooted me. The oak table gleamed under the lamplight, a silent partner in my fight. I thought of Davis, his hand closing over that envelope, of the pharmacist scribbling carelessly what was not his to sign, of Clara, her fingers clutching papers that never belonged to her. They thought they were clever, covering their tracks with money and deception. But they forgot one thing: time. Time records everything. The Ring camera doesn't forget. Ink doesn't fade. Receipts don't vanish. And time, I realized, was finally on my side. The grandfather clock struck 9, its chimes rolling through the room with deliberate force. Each one felt like a declaration. You are not alone. You are not crazy. You are not defeated. I picked up the forged form, slid it into a manila folder. Then the video file copied onto a USB stick. Then the photo of Davis folded neatly into another envelope. All of it was evidence not just of their betrayal, but of my clarity. For the first time in months, my body relaxed. My shoulders lowered, my breathing steadied. Betrayal had cracked the walls, but through those cracks, the truth shone. I closed my eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of the clock behind me. Healing seeped in quietly, not as forgiveness, but as certainty. Certainty that lies cannot stand forever. When I opened my eyes again, the oak table was no longer a place of grief. It was a war room, and I was no longer a victim gathering scraps. I was a strategist gathering weapons. Paperwork would be my shield. Evidence would be my sword. And the cracks of betrayal, instead of destroying me, would become the very lines along which their facade shattered. By the time I gathered all the evidence, I knew there was no turning back. Betrayal had moved from whispers to signatures, from shadows to envelopes of cash. It was no longer a family quarrel, it was a legal war. When I first stepped into Weber's office, I carried my manila folder like a lifeline. He greeted me with a firm handshake, his eyes not just professional, but kind. He gestured toward a chair and slid another folder across the desk. The tab read, Case 4511B. "This will be your case file," he said, tapping the label. "From here on, everything goes inside. Receipts, statements, recordings. Paperwork is stronger than memory in court." I nodded, setting my own folder next to his. Together they looked like twin shields. Of course I could hear society's questions echoing around me, the ones that never leave mothers like me alone. Do parents have the right to sue their own children? Some would call it unnatural, unforgivable. But what happens when those children have turned their parents into prey? When the roles reverse and the ones meant to protect become the ones who exploit? Should family matters be dragged into public courtrooms? Isn't it shameful to air bloodline conflicts where strangers can judge? But silence, I've learned, protects no one except the abuser. And another question, quieter but piercing. Can a lawyer truly empathize with someone like me, or am I just another case number, another retainer fee? Weber answered that last question before I even asked. As he flipped through my receipts, he paused. "I know what this feels like," he said. His voice softened. "My own son hasn't spoken to me in 8 years. He told me once that money was the only language I understood. He was wrong, but I still hear it at night." His confession stunned me. Here was a man who lived behind legal jargon suddenly handing me a piece of his own pain. For the first time, I felt less like a client and more like an ally. Healing can take the shape of solidarity, and in that moment, I felt it. His story didn't lessen mine, but it stitched us together. That night back at home, I sat at the oak table arranging documents into neat piles. The forged pharmacy formed the Ring camera footage Davis with his envelope. Each piece slid into the folder marked Case 4521B. My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from the weight of truth becoming armor. Then my computer chimed. A new email. I clicked it open. The subject line hit me like a fist, final warning. The message was short, unsigned, but I knew whose hands had typed it. Threats of embarrassment, of being declared incompetent, of being put away. My stomach clenched, but I printed the email and placed it carefully into the folder. Paperwork once again stronger than threats. As the night stretched on, I reached for my old checkbook. Its cover was worn, corners frayed from years of use. I ran my fingers across the faded leather. This book had been the instrument of my sacrifice, each page a quiet surrender. Tonight it became something else, a symbol not of giving, but of endurance. I held it tightly like a talisman. For all they had taken, they hadn't stripped me of the will to fight. At precisely 9 o'clock, the grandfather clock struck 9 times. The sound filled the house, rolling through each room with authority. It didn't sound ominous this time. It sounded like preparation, like the call to readiness before a storm. I closed the folder, exhaled, and whispered to myself, "We are never too old to find allies." The battle ahead would not be easy. Courtrooms are not built to soothe the wounded. They are built to dissect, to measure, to weigh. But I knew this, I would not walk in alone. I would carry Weber's empathy, Eleanor's cornbread, the garden club's trembling words, and the steady beat of my clock. And most of all, I would carry myself no longer erased, no longer silenced, but prepared. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. My shoes clicked against the marble floor as I followed Weber inside. I had clutched evidence for weeks, receipts, recordings, emails, and now it was time to lay them bare. We entered the courtroom just as the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Everyone stood as the judge walked in robes, flowing eyes scanning the room with the weight of authority. My knees wanted to buckle, but I held myself upright. I had promised I would not tremble here. The questions thundered in my head as we sat. Should families be exposed like this under the gaze of strangers, to strip away privacy, to lay wounds open for the world to see? It felt cruel. But silence would have been crueler still. Do children have the right to claim all their parents' assets? Some lawyers argue yes, painting it as inheritance in advance. But inheritance is a gift, not a demand. My savings were never theirs to seize. And can tears shed in a courtroom be trusted? Clara's sobs had always been perfectly timed, her mascara running like black rivers on cue. I wondered if the judge could hear the rehearsed notes in her voice, the performance polished to manipulation. The proceedings began. Clara sat across from me, a tissue pressed to her cheek, whispering into Daniel's shoulder. Their lawyer painted me as frail, confused, unfit to manage my own affairs. Weber stood calmly organizing papers, his presence a steady anchor. When my turn came, he handed me the checkbook I had carried for decades. I opened it slowly, laying out each carbon copy. Receipts numbered 1045 through 1076, each one for $500 written in my hand, paid to Daniel month after month. The courtroom grew silent. The paper spoke louder than Clara's wails. Their lawyer tried to object, but Weber pressed forward. When was the last time Daniel called his mother without asking for money? The question cut through the room like glass shattering. Daniel shifted in his chair, his face flushed. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Clara squeezed his arm, tears still sliding down her cheeks, but the silence was louder than any defense. Everyone still carried the image of the 5:42 p.m. clip in their minds. Clara's hand slipped into my mailbox, pulling out papers she had no right to touch. The clip lasted only seconds, but it landed heavier than hours of testimony. The judge leaned forward, expression tightening. Papers rustled, pens scratched, but no words could soften what the video had shown. I stood when called my body steady. My heart pounded, but I would not let it show. Healing sometimes means standing tall even when every muscle begs you to sit. I spoke simply, I am not incompetent. I am not confused. I am a mother who gave everything, and I will not be erased. The words hung in the air, quiet but undeniable. Weber closed with calm precision. He gestured to the mountain of receipts, the forged signatures, the time-stamped video. Your Honor, the truth is not in their tears. It is in the paperwork, and the records speak for themselves. The silence stretched thick as stone. Then from the hallway I heard it, the deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock back home, striking 12. Not here, not in this courthouse, but in my mind. 12 strikes each one, tolling like the voice of justice itself. The judge's gavel came down with finality. The petition is denied. Mrs. Cole retains full control of her affairs. The accusations are found to be without merit. Relief flooded me not as a burst, but as a steady wave. My legs held firm. I did not cry, I did not shake. I stood there as I had promised, unbroken. For years I had been treated as a checkbook with feelings. Today I was recognized as a person again. And as the courtroom emptied, I whispered to myself, justice isn't revenge, it's freedom. The courtroom had fallen into a silence so sharp it felt like glass. My palms rested flat against the wooden table as the judge shuffled papers, adjusting his glasses. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. Then, in a voice steady and unmistakable, he began the verdict. The petition to strip Mrs. Cole of her autonomy is hereby denied. All accusations are deemed unfounded. She retains full legal control of her finances and affairs. His words were clear, each syllable deliberate. It was over. 3 questions echoed in the stillness questions society never stops asking. When parents win against their children in court, does it sever the bond forever? Some will say yes, that no relationship survives public exposure. But I knew the bond had already been broken long before the gavel fell. Can children ever redeem themselves after such betrayal? Perhaps some can. But repentance requires truth, not more lies. Daniel had tears in his eyes now, but were they regret or humiliation? And should communities involve themselves in what looks like private family business? Today proved the answer yes, because silence in the face of abuse is not respect, it is complicity. I turned my head slightly. Daniel sat slumped at the defense table, his shoulders curved inward, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. His head bowed low, and when he lifted it for a moment, a tear slid down his cheek. Not the staged sobbing of Clara, but a single tear that betrayed something deeper, maybe shame, maybe sorrow. Across the aisle, Clara pressed tissues against her face, mascara streaks smudging like war paint. Her performance no longer drew sympathy. The gallery's eyes had hardened. The judge's tone had stripped her act bare. And then came the sound that cut through the tension like sunlight, a ripple of movement at the back of the courtroom. Eleanor and the garden club, gray-haired and resolute, rose to their feet. One by one, their hands came together in applause. The sound grew, filling the chamber, echoing against the paneled walls. The judge rapped the gavel once, but did not stop them. For once, dignity allowed itself to be loud. I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't victory that moved me, it was recognition. Recognition that I wasn't alone, that this fight had meaning beyond myself. Healing often arrives in ordinary gestures. When I returned home later that evening, I set a single cup of coffee onto the oak table. No files, no folders, no trembling receipts, just a cup resting on wood that had borne too much weight. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the background, not ominous now, but steady, familiar. Its rhythm was no longer judgment. It was time, and time was mine again. I looked straight into the mirror above the mantel and spoke aloud so there would be no mistake, no silence left to swallow my truth. Justice isn't revenge. It's freedom. The words didn't need an audience. They were for me, for Eleanor, for the women who had written trembling letters, for every parent who had ever been told they were nothing more than a bank account. Daniel's bowed head, Eleanor's applause, the judge's verdict, they would all live in memory. But more than that, they would live in the space I reclaimed for myself. The oak table, the grandfather clock, and the quiet freedom of knowing I had stood, I had not broken, and I had won. After the trial, my life no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a blank page. I left the old house heavy with memories and shadows and moved into a small apartment on the east side of town. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. When the movers carried in the oak table and the grandfather clock, I felt an anchor settle into the new space. Those 2 objects had carried the story of my pain, but they would also carry the story of my freedom. Society never stops debating even when verdicts are final. Should the elderly cling to family ties, no matter how toxic, or guard their independence, even at the cost of being alone? I chose freedom, because loneliness with dignity is gentler than company with cruelty. Is forgiveness possible for betrayal that cuts this deep? Some will argue that mercy heals faster than justice, but forgiveness must grow naturally, not be demanded like rent overdue. And is personal freedom greater than blood ties? My answer is simple: blood may link us, but freedom defines us. I filled my new life with small, deliberate acts of healing. On Monday mornings, I carried a sketchbook to the community college art class. My hands, once cramped from writing checks, now trace lines of charcoal across paper. I learned how to shape shadows, how to capture light. Every drawing felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I had abandoned long ago. One afternoon, the mailman slipped an envelope under my door. Inside was a thank you card from the local charity where I had donated part of my savings. Their handwriting was uneven but heartfelt. Your gift kept our shelter open another month. I pressed the card against my chest, feeling its warmth spread through me. My money was no longer demanded, it was offered, and it made a difference. Each morning began the same way. I brewed coffee, set a cup gently onto the oak table, and sat in silence. Outside, buses hissed and children shouted on their way to school. Inside, I let the quiet wrap around me. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, its pendulum swaying in rhythm. The sound no longer mocked me, no longer marked hours of sacrifice. It marked freedom, steady, unyielding mine. I lifted the cup, sipped, and smiled. Healing didn't come as fireworks. It came as mornings like this, where silence was no longer heavy but holy. One evening, as the sun dipped low, my phone began to vibrate on the table. I glanced at the screen. Clara's name. For a moment, I let it ring, the sound blending with the tick of the clock. Then I answered. Her voice was raw, breaking. "The rent is overdue. We don't have anything left. Can you help us?" I felt no anger, no triumph, only clarity. I let the silence hang a moment, then replied gently, almost kindly, "Didn't I warn you I ended the call?" My heart was steady. The past could no longer command me. I know some will wonder if I regretted choosing independence over reconciliation, but regret belongs to those who never acted. I acted. I drew a line. I chose life on my terms. Eleanor visited the next day, bringing cornbread as always. She sat across from me, looked around my apartment, and said, "It feels lighter here." She was right. The air was lighter. The silence was lighter. Even I felt lighter. As I set down my coffee cup, I looked into the lens of memory, into the invisible audience of others who might feel trapped as I once was. If you had to choose, keep paying to preserve a false family or keep your dignity to preserve your soul, what would you choose? I know my answer. And with each tick of the clock, with each line of charcoal drawn, I know I will never forget it. Justice gave me freedom. Freedom gave me peace, and peace at last gave me back myself. If this story touched something inside you, I want to hear from you. As a mother, as a father, as someone who knows the weight of sacrifice, tell me, have you ever felt taken for granted by the very people you gave everything to share your truth in the comments? Your voice matters here. Don't just listen. Be part of this community of strength, dignity, and healing. And if you're watching from Atlanta, Chicago, New York, or any place in between, let us know where you're tuning in from. We are building something bigger than a channel. We are building a family that refuses to stay silent. Hit subscribe, share this story, and stand with us. Because justice isn't just a verdict, it's a journey we walk together.